Montana Territory. Autumn of 1877, the wind carried the smell of pine and the sharp scent of cold iron from the distant mountains. Flora Ellery had not slept a full night in over a year. Not since her husband died in a flash flood, leaving her with a newborn baby and a half-burned cabin on the edge of the Bitterroot Range. She had rebuilt what she could, planted potatoes with her bare hands, and learned to shoot straight enough to keep wolves off the porch. But nothing, not prayer, not whiskey, not even exhaustion could make her feel safe enough to close both eyes at once. Tonight, she crouched beside her baby's cradle, wrapping little Grace in a wool blanket. The baby's soft breaths were steady, her tiny hand clutched around a carved wooden rabbit. Flora brushed a strand of hair from her own damp forehead. Her rifle leaned against the wall, loaded. The door was barred. Still, her chest stayed tight. A knock came. Not loud, not rushed. Just 3 soft raps against the timber. She froze, then she heard a voice low, calm, and familiar. Flora. "It's me, Boone." She opened the door with one hand on her rifle. Boone Calder stood there in the moonlight, taller than she remembered, hat in his hands, a bedroll slung over one shoulder. His shirt was dusty, his jaw rough with travel stubble. But his eyes were the same dark, steady, and full of something she had not seen in a long time, concern. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice low so she would not wake Grace. Boone stepped inside slowly. "Heard from town you were out here alone. Thought maybe you could use a hand." "I can manage," she said, though the tremble in her hands betrayed her. He glanced at the cradle, then back at her. "You do not have to prove anything to me." Flora swallowed hard and stepped aside so he could come in. The fire had burned low. Boone knelt and added 2 logs without asking. He did not talk too much, just sat cross-legged on the floor, warming his hands. She watched him, unsure what to do with the sudden quiet that felt safe. "I have 1 extra bedroll," he said after a while. "If it is all right, I will stay out on the porch tonight," she hesitated. "You do not have to do that, I know." She looked down at her daughter, then at Boone. There was something in his presence solid, unbothered, that made her knees weaken more than fear ever had. "Boone," she said. "I have not slept more than 2 hours at a time since Grace was born. Every sound in the dark makes me sure someone's coming." He nodded. "I will sit by her cradle. You go lie down." She blinked. "What?" "You get some rest, Flora. Just sleep. I will keep watch." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him she did not need help, that she was fine. But the truth was, her eyes burned and her bones ached and her heart had not unclenched in months. She nodded slowly and back toward the cot, never taking her eyes off him. Boone lowered himself into the wooden chair beside the cradle, rifle across his lap, gaze fixed forward. She laid down fully dressed, just in case. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Boone's silhouette beside her baby. She woke up to morning light spilling across the cabin floor in silence. Not the tense kind, but the warm kind. Grace was still asleep. Boone had not moved. His eyes were red, but he was awake, still sitting guard. When she sat up, he turned toward her. "You slept," he said gently. She nodded, her throat thick. "All night." He smiled, just a little. She rose and poured water into the tin kettle, hands steadier than they had been in months. "You hungry?" "Sure." She cooked. He chopped more wood. By midday, she had really laughed for the first time in over a year. It felt strange, like remembering a tune she thought she had forgotten. He stayed that night too. Again, he sat by the cradle so she could sleep. By the 3rd night, she stopped asking why he stayed. That week, he fixed the front door hinge, patched the roof, and built a better pen for the chickens. She taught him how to make her husband's old stew recipe. He taught her how to sharpen a knife like a soldier. Boone never pushed. He never asked for anything. He did not talk about his past, and she did not pry, but some nights he would stare into the fire a long time before speaking. "I used to be a scout," he said one evening. "Saw too much, did worse." She did not flinch. "You are not that man now." He had looked at her then, like he was seeing something he did not expect, and when her hand brushed his as they cleaned up after dinner, he did not pull away. Neither did she. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. One morning, Flora found Grace giggling in Boone's lap while he carved a new wooden toy. Her heart clenched, but not with fear this time, with something warmer. Boone looked up at her. "She has your eyes." "She has her own," Flora said, "but maybe she is safer with yours watching over her." That night, she sat beside him by the fire after Grace had gone to sleep. "I never thanked you," she said. He shook his head. "You do not owe me anything." She turned toward him slowly. "I do not want to sleep alone anymore." He went still. "Flora." "I mean it," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I do not mean just tonight. I mean, I want you here with us. I want Grace to grow up knowing what it feels like to be safe, and I want to know what it feels like to be loved." His jaw clenched, but his eyes softened. "You sure?" She nodded. "I have never been more sure." Boone reached for her hand, rough palm against her fingers, and held it like something precious. "I will never leave you," he said. "Not you, not her." She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the air in the cabin felt full not of fear, but of something steadier. Hope. By the end of October, snow gathered thick in the branches above the cabin. The sky held a flat, pewter weight, and the air bit deeper with every passing day. Inside, the hearth burned steady, casting a golden hush across the plank floor. Boone had taken to bringing in kindling before dawn, so Flora wouldn't have to step outside with Grace bundled in her shawl. One morning, she found him bent over the stump behind the cabin, splitting logs with a wedge and mallet instead of an axe. His shoulder bore an old scar she hadn't noticed before, thin and pale like a whip mark. She didn't ask about it, but when she brought him a tin cup of warm cider, she handed it over without a word. He looked at her, quiet, grateful, and drank. Later that week, a rough wind tore shingles from the roof above the lean-to. Flora stood beside him as he examined the break. "I'll need some cedar shakes," he said, brushing snow from the edge. "But I can't cut and shape enough alone before the next storm." "I'll ride to the mill," she said. "You stay with Grace." He turned then, brows low. "You don't owe me that risk." "She's asleep by 6, Flora said. "I can be back by noon if I leave early. She'll wake and not find you. She'll find you." He didn't argue again. The next morning, she left wrapped in her husband's old coat, the cuff still stained from summer planting. The trail to the mill curled through a narrow pass where frost clung to the pines in thick lace. Her mare was steady-footed, and the snow hadn't drifted too deep yet. Back at the cabin, Boone sat on the floor beside Grace's cradle, a length of soft cotton in his lap. He'd whittled a set of carved animals the week before: elk, bear, fox, and now he was sewing them into a string to hang above her bed. She stirred once, let out a high, sleepy breath, then settled again. By the time Flora returned, cheeks flushed and saddle dusted with ice, Boone had cleared the table and boiled a pot of beans with onion and salt pork. She stepped through the door, dropped the bundle of cedar shakes, and leaned against the wall like the ride had peeled off her skin layer by layer. "You all right?" Boone asked. She nodded once. "I saw a man near the creek bend." Boone's jaw shifted, but his voice stayed even. "Did he approach?" "No, just watched." "Then rode off north. Could have been trapping, could have been looking." He crossed the room, pulled his coat from the peg, and stepped outside without another word. She didn't stop him, just stirred the pot and checked Grace's blanket. It was near dark when Boone returned. He shook snow from his shoulders and unwrapped a stiff, damp scrap of paper from his coat pocket. Found this wedged under a rock where he stood. He handed it over. The handwriting was rough block. It read, "You'll starve come true winter. Sell and leave." She stared at it a long moment, then folded it in half and dropped it into the fire. "I'm not leaving," she said. Boone didn't speak. He just moved behind her, placed one hand lightly on the small of her back, and let it rest there. The touch didn't frighten her, it steadied her. That night, as Grace slept and the wind pressed against the shutters, Flora sat across the table from him with her tea cooling between her palms. "I used to think I was strong because I could endure things," she said. "Now I think maybe strength means knowing when to let someone help you." Boone glanced up. "You let me in." "I needed to, and not just for the baby." He He said nothing for a while. The shadows shifted on the walls, then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I never planned to stay anywhere again," he said. "I figured I'd ride until my body gave out or the land forgot me. It remembered you here." He looked at her then, and something in the room tilted, quiet and deep. She reached across the table, took his hand, and didn't let go. His fingers closed around hers like they were made to rest there. In the morning, she found him not sitting by the cradle, but lying beside her on the floor, the baby between them in her basket. Flora's hand was tucked beneath his, and Grace's small foot pressed against his chest. No one knocked at the door that day. No one watched from the trees. When Boone rose, he kissed her temple before stepping outside. She didn't flinch. She didn't wonder. She just smiled and reached down to wrap Grace in another layer of wool, the firelight catching in her daughter's lashes as the snow fell slow and quiet beyond the window. The snow deepened before November was out, dry and powdery, piling high against the north wall of the barn. Boone had taken to checking the traps every 3 days, bringing back rabbit or grouse when luck held, his boots crusted in white by the time he returned. Flora kept the hearth warm and the stew pot busy, drying herbs from the cellar beams and stitching new soles onto Grace's tiny moccasins. One morning, while Boone was hammering down a loose shutter, a rider came to the edge of their clearing. The horse was lean, all ribs and restless steps, and the man astride it wore a coat torn down the sleeve, his cheeks split and healing raw. Flora stood on the porch with Grace in her arms, one hand on the doorframe. Boone stepped down from the ladder, hammer low in his hand. "Elias," Boone said. The man didn't smile. "Didn't know you were still up this way." Boone glanced back at Flora. "Didn't expect you to be." "Ran out of dry places," Elias said. "Figured I'd try west of Missoula, but there's no work out there, just a lot of folks pretending the war didn't touch them." Flora didn't speak. Grace stirred against her shoulder and she stepped back inside, letting the door rest half open. Elias dismounted slowly. "Didn't come for trouble," he added. "Just need a place to thaw for a few nights. I'll sleep in the barn." Boone looked at the man for a long while. "You still carrying?" Elias lifted his coat aside, showing an empty holster. Boone nodded once. "You can stay in the loft. Hay's dry up there." Elias led the horse around back without another word. Inside, Flora fed Grace and kept her voice low. Later, when Boone came in and brushed the snow from his coat, she set a bowl of beans and cornmeal beside the fire. "Who is he?" "We rode together in Virginia," Boone said. "He's not a man I'd call a friend, but we kept each other breathing when bullets came too fast to count." She watched Boone sit, his shoulders stiffer than usual. "He looking to stay?" "No," Boone said. "He doesn't belong to stillness." That night, they heard Elias moving in the loft above the barn, pacing slow. The wind scraped dry branches against the roof, and Grace cried once, but settled when Boone lifted her gently, rocking her with a touch that had grown easy in his hands. When Flora returned from the root cellar 2 days later, Boone was sitting with Elias at the edge of the clearing, both men hunched over a small fire. She didn't approach, but she watched from the porch, arms crossed against her chest. Later, Boone came back alone. He unlaced his boots and set them by the hearth before speaking. "He's leaving at first light," he said. "Off to Butt. Says a man named Lindley's offering wages for mine guarding." Flora nodded. Boone sat across from her. He asked if I'd go with him. She didn't move. "I told him no." She let out a breath. "You didn't think to ask me." His voice was quiet. "I didn't need to." They sat in silence, the fire popping between them. Then Boone leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You know what I used to believe," he said. "That if I stood still long enough, all the things I'd done would catch up and take me under. So I kept riding, kept saying no to anything that looked like peace." Flora folded Grace's blanket tighter around her daughter's legs. "And now, I want to be here when she says her first word. I want to split fence posts with you in the spring. I want to go to town with a list and come back with more than I left with." She didn't look away. "You think peace won't catch up here? I think maybe it already has." She rose and crossed to the cradle, laying Grace down with careful hands. Boone stood behind her, close but not touching. "I've been waiting to feel safe again," she said. "And every day with you I get closer." He reached out, gentle, and placed his hand over hers on the cradle's edge. "I never thought I'd be a father," he said. "But I want to be the kind of man she can count on." Flora turned, her eyes steady. "Then stay, not just through the winter, stay through the planting, through the years." She saw the answer in his face before he said it, a quiet certainty. A man who had run far enough and was finally ready to build something with his two hands. "I'm yours," he said, "if you'll have me." She leaned into him, her forehead against his chest, his arms closing around her. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, and the cradle rocked gently beside them. The thaw came late. March dragged its heels, laying down sleet and letting it freeze again before the sun dared stay out past midday. The cabin stayed warm enough, thanks to the stacked wood Boone hauled in every few days, but the air inside had grown tighter with waiting. Flora could feel it in her shoulders, the way she paused before opening the door, listening for anything unusual. The man who left the note hadn't returned, but the memory lingered, not in fear exactly, but in preparedness. Grace had started pulling herself up on the edge of her cradle, wobbling on unsteady legs and laughing whenever Flora caught her. There were moments when Boone would lift her high and she'd squeal, arms flailing, and Flora would forget the weight she carried. Those moments were growing. One morning, Flora laid out the last of the cornmeal to make griddle cakes. Boone came in from the shed with his hands red from cold water and a worn canvas bundle under his arm. "I found this in the loft," he said, unrolling it on the table. Inside were two long-handled tools and a rusted tin box. "Your husband's, I think." She reached out and ran her fingers along the handle of the old drawknife. "He meant to carve fence rails with this come spring." Boone didn't speak. He pulled out the sharpening stone and set to working the blade in slow circles. "I thought about burning it," she said. "Right after he died. Everything that had his name on it just felt like a weight I couldn't lift." Boone looked over at her, his hand never pausing. "But you didn't." "I couldn't. I kept thinking maybe Grace would want to know what kind of man her father was." She folded her arms, gaze steady. "He was kind, he never raised his voice, and he never looked at me like I was too much." Boone's jaw shifted, but not in discomfort. "There's no part of you that's too much." She picked up the tin box. Inside were scraps of leather, some buttons, a few old coins, and a folded paper with faded ink. "It was a seed order, never mailed. He had plans," she said. "And I've been afraid that making new ones would mean I was letting go of his." Boone set down the blade and wiped his hands on his trousers. "I'm not here to replace anything, Flora, I know," she said. "But you're part of what's next." That afternoon, she walked the perimeter of the clearing while Boone dug a new post hole by the gate. The ground was still half frozen, but he worked slow, steady. She watched the way he leaned into the shovel, the way he paused to roll his sleeves back and stretch his shoulder. Something about it made her chest tighten, not with grief, but with recognition. At supper, they ate quietly while Grace gnawed on a strip of dried apple. The light outside had softened into that pale stretch between dusk and dark, when the sky turns lavender and the trees go quiet. "I've been thinking," Boone said, setting down his fork, "about taking in a few head of cattle come summer." Flora raised her brows. "That's no small undertaking." "I know," he said, "but we've got grazing land just west of the creek. If we build a low fence and keep the salt blocks fresh, it could work." She leaned back in her chair. "You planning to stay through summer then?" His gaze didn't waver. "I'm planning to stay through whatever comes." She reached across the table, her hand finding his with an ease that no longer felt new. "Then let's plant more than potatoes this year." The next morning, Flora brought down a small box from the top shelf of the cupboard. Inside were folded scraps of muslin, bits of lace, and 2 skeins of wool yarn, one blue, one cream. She laid them out on the table while Boone cut lengths of cedar for the cradle's new rocker base. "These were meant for a christening dress," she said. "But I never finished it." Boone brushed a curl of sawdust from the table's edge. "Would you want to?" She glanced over at Grace, who sat chewing on her fingers in the corner of the rug. "I think I'd like her to wear it the day we stand before the pastor." Boone stilled. "You mean?" "I do," she said. "I want it to be real, not just you here in the evenings, not just sharing chores. I want us to be bound." He came to her slowly, so she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since the first time I woke up and didn't feel afraid." He wrapped his arms around her, slow and certain, and she leaned into him, heart steady, fear gone. Outside, the snow was melting in earnest, pooling into the ruts of the old wagon path and running in thin ribbons toward the trees. The thaw had come, and with it, the promise of something lasting. The first Sunday in April broke clear. The sky stretched wide and pale over the bitterroots, and meltwater ran in soft trickles through the ruts near the barn. Flora rose early with Grace still asleep on her shoulder and stepped out onto the porch where a new warmth had settled in the air. The scent of thawed earth rose beneath the pines, and the robins were back, their calls weaving through the quiet like threads through linen. Boone stood at the edge of the clearing, sleeves rolled, tapping fence stakes into the softening ground. She watched him a moment before calling out. "I want to marry in the open," she said. "Here, with the mountains behind us." He turned, hammer resting against his thigh. "Then that's where it'll be." It took 3 days to ready the spot. Boone cleared the brush near the east fence line where the creek bent close. Flora stitched a ribbon into Grace's bonnet and scrubbed the last of winter's soot from the cabin windows. The pastor came by wagon from the next valley over, his wife beside him, arms full of fresh bread and early tulips wrapped in cheesecloth. She pressed them into Flora's hands with a dry-eyed smile and said nothing, which Flora was grateful for. Boone shaved with the straight razor she'd kept buried in a drawer since her husband passed. She handed it to him without a word, and he nodded once before stepping outside to a basin. When he came back in, his face clean and his hair combed flat, Grace reached for him. He lifted her into the crook of his arm and let her tug at his collar. The sun was high by the time they stood together under the cottonwood. Grace sat in her cradle, lulled by the breeze and the low voice of the pastor reading from his worn leather Bible. Flora's dress was simple muslin, the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Boone wore his best trousers and the shirt she had mended at the shoulder only a week before. When the pastor asked if they would pledge themselves freely and without regret, Flora answered before the words had fully left his mouth. "I will." Boone took her hand with both of his. "I already have." They signed their names in the pastor's ledger, then shared bread and coffee with him and his wife beneath the greatcoat Boone had spread over the grass. Grace babbled and crawled between them, her bonnet askew, her cheeks pink from sun and wind. Flora laughed once, quiet and low, and Boone looked at her like he'd never seen anything so sure. That night, after the pastor's wagon had disappeared down the ridge and Grace had fallen asleep with her hand curled around a pine button, Boone carved a line into the cedar beam above the hearth. "For the day it all began," he said. Flora leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching the firelight catch in his hair. "Not the day we met," he shook his head. "That day was trouble, this one's peace." She crossed to him, barefoot on the warm planks, and took his hand. "You brought us through the worst of it. I want you to know that." He turned toward her, his hand settling at the small of her back. "You built something worth staying for." Their kiss was slow, unhurried, the kind that didn't reach for more than what was already given. When they lay down that night, it wasn't beside the cradle or on the floor, it was in the bed they had built together just the week before, its joints fitted tight, the quilt stitched from cloth Flora had saved over the years. In the months that followed, the fence grew to circle the pasture. 3 head of cattle arrived by wagon from a rancher Boone once helped track rustlers for. Flora planted rows of squash and beans, and when she bent to weed them, Boone set Grace on a blanket nearby and whittled toys from the spare cedar scraps. They built a chicken coop with a door that latched tight against foxes. Flora taught Boone how to churn butter, and he taught her how to track the direction of storm clouds by the curl of the wind. They took turns rising in the night when Grace fussed, and sometimes they both rose, just to sit together beside the cradle and listen to her breathe. One evening in late summer, as the sun slipped low and the air turned golden, Boone stood beside the gate, arm resting on the top rail. "She'll never know anything but this place," he said. "She'll know love," Flora replied, stepping up beside him, "and steadiness. That's more than most children are born into." He nodded once, then turned to her. "I want more than one," Flora laughed, not sharp but warm. "Then you'd better start tilling another row." By the time the leaves turned again, Flora's belly had begun to round. Grace took her first steps near the hearth, arms flailing as Boone held out a wooden spoon with both hands like it was gold. Flora clapped once and wept, not from worry this time, but from the kind of joy that sits deep in the chest and doesn't ask for anything more. The winter that followed was long but not hard. The roof held. The food lasted. The fences stood. And when the snow came, they held each other close, three bodies wrapped beneath one quilt, waiting for the sound of spring. Years passed. Grace grew into a girl with knees always scraped and questions that never ended. Flora taught her to read by lamplight. Boone taught her how to saddle a horse. Another daughter followed, then a boy. The fields stretched wider each season and the cabin filled with laughter, flour dust, and the smell of warm bread. Boone never left again, not once. And Flora, who had once feared the silence of her own breath, came to fill each day with the sound of a life fully lived. They grew old together, side by side. And not once did either of them ever forget the night he sat beside her cradle and kept her safe until morning.